G'day, Mark Pesce here. It is my pleasure to be talking to the National Trust this morning. We're going to be talking about some of the ways we change our understanding of place as we enter a new era of augmented reality. Because, in fact, what it does is it fundamentally touches on the work of organizations like the National Trust. Let's take a look at how we actually do that work today. So recently, I took a walk down George Street, and as I did, I looked for memorial plaques that were on the buildings. Why do we place a memorial plaque on a building? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to affix some information to a space, information to a building that wouldn't normally be revealed by the presence of the building itself. So it's a form of metadata. Extra information, human readable information that we physically attach to a place. And we do this in order to indicate all sorts of information, such as who used that building, when the building was created, when they chose to commemorate the creation of that building, perhaps something about the deep history of this building over time. In every case, what we're doing is we're taking some human information and physically applying it to a space so that it's fixed in space to that building. And we've been doing this for many, many years. This is a standard practice of how we commemorate space. All right, over the last 30 years, what we've seen is that in cyberspace, which is no space at all, we have spent the last 30 years building up an enormous repository of human information. Not quite everything that's known in the human world is in cyberspace now, but we've got a fairly reasonable percentage of that, and we've seen that grow. It grew explosively in the 90s and in the 2000s, and of course now in the 2010s. And in fact, there's so much information in cyberspace now. Our problem is not access to information, but rather being able to determine the reliability of any information that is presenting itself to us as factual. So the hyper-informative environment that we have now presents us with some paradoxes, which is that it is possible to be too informed about something so that one is just poorly informed about it. But we now have this intense pressure coming from all of the information that has been piled into this cyberspace. Now, the thing about cyberspace is not attached to a place at all. It floats freely. It kind of exists inside of our heads. It exists on the networks. It exists somewhere out there on the cloud, but it doesn't really exist in place. It is not situated at all. Now we're starting to see a brand new technology that actually allows us to situate human information in space. This technology is known as augmented reality, and I don't really want to talk about the specifics of how you implement the technology because that will change over time. I want to talk about the two specific qualities of this technology. This technology allows us to situate information in space. That's one half of the technology. The other half of the technology is anything that allows you to make that information that has been situated in space visible. Now, in this example, what you're seeing is they've situated a painting, I believe, by Da Vinci in space with this person, so that if you're looking through the device, in this case a smartphone, you can see the Da Vinci that has been situated on the wall next to the person. That isn't actually true in reality, but in augmented reality, this information, this painting, has been situated in that space. So this is the basic operation of augmented reality, is situating data, information in a particular space, and then making that data visible. All right. We're going to be doing this at scale. Over the next decade to 15 years, basically the entire world and every facet of the world will now be annotated, all of the spaces. So you can start at the city level, as you would in Sydney. How would you annotate all of the space that is Sydney? And of course, we see this already happening in maps. But now you start to drill down, you might be doing it to a neighborhood. For example, the Rocks. How would you annotate the Rocks, which is the most historical part of Sydney? There's an enormous amount of information, of data, of metadata, of history that is available here. How do we apply it to this place? And then you go down to the level of a street. This is Argyle. How do you apply that information to a street itself? How do you make that information visible? How do you make it meaningful? How do you make it historically accurate? And then we come down to the level of a building. This is the Argyle stores. And Interestingly, there's already metadata for the Argyle stories. If you go onto Wikipedia, you can find there's a Wikipedia entry that will tell you everything you want to know about the Argyle stories. But that metadata, that Wikipedia entry, is not applied in place. It is not available just by having a presence at the building. You have to go into Wikipedia, into human cyberspace, which is not located. You have to find it and you have to pull it out. Now, one thing we have to note, which is very important, is that there's always more than one story that you can tell about a place. And in fact, in this case, there was a recent article published in The Guardian about what they call the famous last party, which was basically the last party at Mardi Gras in 2020, right before Australia went into lockdown. And this writer was writing about that event. I actually happened to be at that party. So part of my own story, but also part of the story of Sydney and part of the story of Mardi Gras actually does center on the Argyle stores. So we have this idea that there are multiple stories that can be affixed to a place to be able to tell the different stories that we want to reveal about the world around us. And all of these are going to be competing for attention inside of augmented reality. All of them will be contending for your attention as the National Trust. Now, if you want to know where we are with the technology is advancing incredibly rapidly. Last year, Microsoft introduced the second version of their HoloLens. It looks a lot like an industrial visor. It costs several $1,000s. It's very effective, but it's basically aimed at commercial uses. Just a year later, we saw Facebook introduce Project Aria. This is the first prototype of what they expect will be a consumer wearable set of glasses. So you put these glasses on, and then wherever you look around, it will reveal the data that has been situated in space around you. By the end of this decade, these spectacles, these augmented reality spectacles, will be nearly as common as smartphones are today. That means most people walking around most of the time will be available to an augmented reality environment, which means the kind of information that we're situating in augmented reality becomes very important because there will be a demand for it. But not just a demand for it, people will be using that information to situate themselves within the stories that we tell ourselves about the world that we live in. And this comes to really a very central feature, and really the question that I want to put to you today as the National Trust. A story helps us understand the space that we're in. And so we always have to ask ourselves, who is telling that story, why they're telling that story, who they're telling that story to. Because these stories tell us where we've come from, they tell us where we're going, they tell us who we are, they tell us what we've done, and they tell us what we should do in the future. So this ability to write space, to inscribe metadata in place is incredibly important. And not just incredibly important, it's incredibly contentious because the way we tell stories and who we tell these stories to has always been fought over. And so you will see many parties with many agendas coming and contending for telling their stories. Now, the National Trust holds the history of the nation, the history of Australia. That is its responsibility. And so you have to think carefully about whether you'll let people write in a particular space that is controlled by the National Trust and the kinds of stories that you will let them portray. This is going to be a major feature of the world that's coming through augmented reality. We can't even see it yet, but that world is already here. And that world tells us one very important thing, that if you change the data in space, you change that space. And when you change space, you change our behavior in that space because we are informed by the data that you have added to that space. Changing space changes us. And so as we move into this era of augmented reality, think carefully about the stories you want to tell, how you want to tell them, who you're telling them to, and why. Thank you very much.